Okay, thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. So this is the 4th edition of our conference on interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research. As you might know, in the very beginning, it was a quite new concept at our university, and we have been working a lot about defining what it is, and we're still struggling with it, but just to say a little word, the idea is to work and combine knowledge from academia with knowledge from social actors and practitioners. In the beginning, we've been working on how this can build better knowledge. So it's the idea of our work at university to work on transdisciplinarity is that for a certain type of very complex, what they call wicked problems, this produces higher quality knowledge. So, and wicked problems mainly are problems where you have a lot of social values there, which are very controversial, a lot of actors with different societal values, which impact on the way that you design your research and which impacts on the knowledge production system. And in those cases, more and more researchers throughout the world try to experiment with co-construction of knowledge, and that's why we're here today. And this really started as a small initiative 4 years ago, where we wanted to invite teams who have the experience with this type of research, like in urban studies or social economy or development cooperation, collaboration with the Global South, to share what they know about knowledge co-construction to other teams who have never done it, like in legal sciences or in engineering. That was the start, but it had so much success that we have many initiatives now around this, and we would like to develop it further. And I have the pleasure today to invite an audience from very different countries. So you have to know that a lot of work on the meta-analysis of this way of doing has been done in the German-speaking countries, essentially Germany, Switzerland, and the Scandinavian countries. And now we have people from Austria, from France, and someone from Germany as well. But I think it's interesting today that that's why it was called a stock-taking exercise, to see what happens in different countries throughout Europe, and to see how different research and specific work have tried to work with this co-construction and the knowledge of societal actors. So I will invite Caroline then to start. We have 4 speakers for today.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm happy to be here. I'm hoping that I can manage to keep the microphone here so it works. Oh, perfect. Okay. So, yeah, my name is Caroline Augenstein. I'm here from Germany, from Wuppertal, close to Cologne. And I work in and on real-world labs in the context of urban transformations. And I'm interested in kind of a structural perspective on real-world labs, so looking into real-world labs as this longer-term, ideally, research infrastructure where scientists and actors from practice collaborate. And also a structural perspective in terms of structuration theory, so looking into, okay, how much can these labs contribute to transformations? Can we study the structure, agency dynamics taking place in these labs to learn something? And this is what takes me to the question of impact. I think that's what I was invited for today, and talking about what kind of impacts can we expect from this kind of research, and also how to evaluate these labs or these transdisciplinary research settings to find out what kind of impact they have. And I will talk about some conceptual ideas, but also some examples from real-world lab projects in the context of urban transformations we did at the Center of Transformation Research and Sustainability in Wuppertal, and with actors from this small city of Wuppertal in Germany. Okay, and so I think my slides are messed up in terms of format, but I think it's okay. So what guides my talk today is the question of how to conceptualize and evaluate impact of real-world labs. And I will start by talking about some of the challenges related to this. And these challenges have to do with the fact that these labs are embedded in like real-world contexts, and there's a lot of difficulty with how to analyze really mechanisms of change and what can we learn about transformations in these contexts, and then also how to assess impact. I will briefly introduce my theoretical perspective on this, so looking at this from looking at structure agency dynamics as something to explain transformation processes and how this works out or can be studied in these transdisciplinary settings. And then I will introduce 2 examples from this real-world lab case in Wuppertal. First introducing an embedded agency perspective as a framework we developed to study these mechanisms of change in these contexts. And then I will show you one case where we tried to do a co-evaluation together with our practice partners of the longer term lab infrastructures and projects we did there. And then in the end I will share some lessons learned from my perspective, and I'm happy to discuss them with you and also discuss with you what could be future research perspectives in this field. Okay. So to start, as Tom indicated, maybe not everyone's super familiar with this field of real-world lab research. So the context where I work, real-world labs are defined or understood as research infrastructures or spaces where actors from science and society come together to work on concrete real-world problems, co-design problems and co-design like the research process, but also generate knowledge together and learn, and also not only learning about transformations, but also really implementing change or facilitating kind of transformation processes. And the key mode of collaborating, of learning and generating knowledge together is doing experiments in these settings. And maybe also to clarify, like the context where I come from, this is usually revolves around like social innovations, how people develop networks or go differently about organizing mobility in a city, or I will introduce some examples. So, but this is kind of the context, and this field of research has gained prominence in the German-speaking world, I would say, with this particular concept over the last 10 to 15 years. So maybe it's time to take stock whether it achieved its goals of creating knowledge about transformations, but also really contributing to transformations in practice. And there has been a recent special issue in the journal Gaia. And here in the editorial, it was kind of summarized, okay, the impacts that we see of this kind of research are often hidden, delayed, unintended, or indirect. And this was posed not as a problem per se, but more as a question of our frameworks. Are they suitable to really find or study or accompany this kind of research? And then there were some, I would say, more rhetorical questions posed, indicating that there's still a need to kind of move beyond this paradigm of controllability, which is not really fit for the governance of complex systems, wicked problems. This was indicated in the intro. And the question, so how can we, when we deal with wicked sustainability challenges, these are usually not simple problems that can be solved or fixed. So how can we deal with those, and how can then real-world labs, as one format of this transdisciplinary research, contribute to systemic and lasting change? So these are really overall general challenges of this kind of research. I would like to break this down a bit for the concrete context of real-world labs. And I would suggest, or I think that there are three key challenges. One relates to the fact that this kind of research is done in real-world contexts. So obviously the boundaries between the lab and its societal context, they are kind of blurry. They are often changing and multifaceted. So we have contexts related to physical stuff, social or cultural norms, but professional logics, anything you can think of that actors working on a problem bring into this. And of course, we have to delineate the boundaries of this lab physically or also with regard to topic, but there is sometimes a tendency to kind of externalize as a context factor, like the root causes of many of these sustainability challenges, like the bigger societal structures causing these problems, and then they're left outside the lab. This is, I think, one challenge, and these blurry boundaries also cause problems when we want to look into the mechanisms of change that happen or that we want to study in these labs. Because we have to find ways of dealing with this complexity in adequate and methodologically sound ways. And another issue is, in this field of research, the evaluation frameworks that we do have, they usually focus very much on the quality of the transdisciplinary processes, like how do scientists and practitioners collaborate in this. I mean, the basic assumption is that we need this kind of research process to deal with these problems. But then the focus of evaluations is on how good is this process, assuming that this will then contribute to solving the problem, but the actual issue of the transformation and solving the problem kind of gets lost. which is a challenge when it comes to these mechanisms of change. And then this, of course, relates to impact. So if we don't really know what the mechanisms of change and the transformation processes are, then it's also difficult to assess what their actual impact is. And of course, we're dealing with complex long-term processes. So many of these effects are delayed, unintended, as already said. So how can we get to finding or identifying them in more systematic ways? And another issue is that there are sometimes really unrealistic expectations of what this kind of research is supposed to deliver. They're often small-scale projects, so they're not going to change the world by themselves. But this kind of leads to this focus on tuning down ambitions very much, just focusing on the concrete project and the project outcomes. And we have this really small and short-term projects, so it's kind of difficult to navigate what kind of ambitions can we have for impact and what can we learn about transformations if this format is to deliver what it promised to do. And so to address these challenges, I think one way to go is to ground this in like transformation concept or transformation theory, here focusing on structure agency dynamics. Assuming that transformations are essentially or can be viewed as these structure agency dynamics where they are shaping unsustainabilities, but we're also looking at actors who are able to critically reflect on unsustainable structures, can deviate, can do things differently, and why this change structures. And this basic foundation in structuration theory is really like a key theoretical foundation for many approaches in sustainability transformations research. So I would kind of place my research in this context where we define transformations as a fundamental change in structure cultural practices, and where we're looking at structure and also unsustainable structures as at the same time medium and outcome of what actors do in their social practices. And so what we're also doing, or what I'm trying to do in real-world lab research, looking into how can these patterns of structure agency dynamics, how can they be changed, and how can we use like experiments and exchange between different perspectives used to kind of do this. And why this kind of theoretical foundation is so well established in transformation research, I would say because it can, on the one hand side, explain stability and path dependencies very well, but can also give a good perspective on how actors can change systems. There's still ongoing critique and debate, and I think it's summarized well in this quote where a colleague said that transition studies often assume rather than really assess these structure agency dynamics empirically. And this is something we're trying to do with frameworks against this background, applying them to real-world labs and also get more of an empirical insight into how these dynamics work. And I would like to introduce one framework that we've been working on with some colleagues, where exactly the question was, okay, how can we systematically trace mechanisms of change in these real-world labs? And our idea was we wanted to focus on impact resulting exactly from these structuration processes. So looking into, do these experiments, do they become embedded, or can they change the dominant ways of doing, thinking, organizing, as like a short for structure in this context? And the idea was to find a way to analyze these more intangible or indirect mechanisms of change that are often argued that they are happening in real-world labs, like changing attitudes, collective action emerging, network and capacity building, stuff like that. And to make these structure agency dynamics, because it's of course very abstract, make this observable and fitting to this context of real-world labs. We combined like a socio-spatial and the socio-psychological dimensions, so looking into the physical, the cultural, regulative and procedural, so how actors use the space, elements or dimensions where experiments induce change, and then look at agency or actors at different levels. So how do individuals, what's their lived experience in these experimental settings? At the collective level, how is what's done in an experiment discussed in groups and larger networks? And for the societal level, kind of as a proxy, looking into how are these experiments and their results taken up in political or media discourses. And so we arrive at these four integrated dimensions at the bottom. So looking at how do actors in these settings, how do they perceive like these physical, cultural, regulative and procedural structures? How do they reframe them? How do they change them? So to have these rather broad but still systematic categories of mapping out what kind of patterns of change can we observe in these labs. And I would like to illustrate this using an example from the promised cases from the city of Wuppertal. And here we did a real-world lab project where we collaborated with a civil society initiative. And the focus of the project was on developing an urban brownfield, like an old industrial site. And this civil society initiative that we worked with, they managed to acquire this site in collaboration with the city and the local bank. And then the question was, okay, how can we develop this space? So how can we develop it in a way that it works economically, but also to fulfill these ideas of having community-oriented, sustainability-oriented initiatives on the space. And the experiment was that we placed old shipping containers, had an open call for participation, so a very typical format for these kind of labs. And then people could apply with different ideas of what to do on this space. And then we had local businesses, social entrepreneurs, artists, a local politician, using these containers and trying out different concepts or activities that they thought could be useful for this place. And the idea was to understand what kind of functions this place could have, and basically a first idea of how to develop it so it fulfills this function also for a community-oriented sustainable development of the larger neighborhood. And then applying this embedded agency perspective to analyze it, we found that, of course, there were changes physically to the space, and this was also perceived like by individuals going to local media. So it used to be this brownfield site and emerged kind of as this multifunctional urban space, which was then interrelated with changes in symbolic meaning and values attached to it. So it used to be the symbol of degradation and economic downturn for the overall city, and then became this place where there was potential and possibility for the future. But it was also really contested. So there were, of course, different groups of actors from society involved. And the biggest kind of conflict or fault line was between those who saw this as a consumption-free zone, really oriented toward community and sustainability, and those that wanted to explore it for more commercial purposes. And there were conflicts. And due to this variety of understandings what this space essentially is and what function it has, what values it stands for, there were also emerging a lot of different practices and use patterns, as I said, especially between those who wanted to do business there and those who saw this as more like a cultural and community space. But what was possible, because this was designed as this experimental kind of space that was really like focused or moderated as something where people would exchange views and were encouraged to talk to each other and reflect on their own experiences, it became possible to kind of balance these different conflicts and conflicting logics. So it was possible to not really solve it and have this unified idea of what the space is supposed to be, but rather kind of a peaceful balance of different ideas and not like really a fixed state. With regard to this fourth dimension, this experiment did not lead to any formal changes in regulation at the municipal level. What it did do, however, is that it led to, or was part of, new formats being found for this initiative, and local politics working together, having different formats of discussing development of this space, but also the larger neighborhood and what other places in the city could learn from this experimental approach. So in sum, what we tried to show, or what we think we can show better with this kind of framework, that there, in these small-scale projects, where it's really hard to quantify what the impact is, we can still find and see that there are patterns that lead to new ways of doing thinking, organizing in this kind of terminology. So there's new meaning that's attached to this place, there's new activities taking place, and also looking at it more structurally in the context of urban planning or urban development in this case, this space landed somewhere in between the logic that you usually have, like is this a public or a private space, is this commercial, is this more leisure, and exists in between. So we would interpret or view this as kind of like a seed for change, or at least a place where existing logics are being challenged and where this capacity is built to do something with it. Of course, this is really super small scale, but we do find these kind of structural changes or seeds for structural change emerging there, but I don't want to leave it with this very single experiment stuff. We also then decided that we want to evaluate kind of the longer term impacts that these kind of experiments can have. 5 minutes, I can make it. And in Wuppertal, we had like around this area and around a typical set of actors, different real-world lab projects over a time frame of 10 years. And so we decided that we wanted to evaluate and look into what did this transdisciplinary collaboration, what kind of societal impact in the city did this induce. And so also here we decided that we wanted to work with a structuration theoretical approach, because the frameworks that we have, as I said, they are really much focused on this transdisciplinary process and project by project evaluation of concrete outcomes. And here the idea was, okay, let's gather together all the researchers involved in different projects, the practice partners involved in different projects, and really have like a broad reflection of what were these maybe delayed or indirect impacts that we can observe in the city and around. So this time we just went with Giddens' modalities of structuration very broadly. We did a series of workshops where we first introduced like the concept of interpretative schemes and norms, allocative and authoritative resources, and then asked especially also the practice partners to do like individual reflection exercises and more or less creative participatory formats, have them reflect on, okay, what kind of interpretative schemes and norms did you draw on in this collaboration? How did it change? Did it travel beyond? Do you find this in administrative departments in the city or the organizations they came from? And also, what kind of resources could you draw on in these collaboration? Has this changed? Are there now more resources available for further projects and initiatives? And so what we found is that these initiatives or this type of collaboration is really good at coining new narratives about transformation and experiments in the city. They also were good at establishing norms of collaboration also with people from the administration or local businesses. But especially practice partners kind of complained, okay, we never have enough resources for this. But what we also found is that these more soft structural impacts did materialize in terms of financial or physical resources. So getting more access to funding opportunities, getting access to the local administration, stuff like that. We also found that we were a bit hesitant of going with this very abstract theoretical framing into this process, but the feedback was that this really worked well for the practice partners, because they were usually annoyed by the very technical questionnaires they had to fill out for other kinds of evaluations. And here said, okay, this is kind of motivating and kind of fosters reflection on what we really did and looking beyond individual projects, and also really think about what is context, what's the experiment, and how does it influence each other. So still, this is not useful to really evaluate was this particular project successful or not. So we would argue that this is a complementary approach that's really useful to complement these more process-based evaluation, but then it's really useful to look at this broader structural change we're interested in. And this was my last example. So briefly, like the lessons learned I take from this kind of work, and I'm happy to discuss, is that I think it can be really useful in this transformation context to focus on impact as the outcome of these embedded structure agency dynamics, and that there is a need for the kind of frameworks that are relatively broad or provide just enough structure to allow for this broader reflections, but still do this in a systematic way. Yeah, as I just said, the second learning for me is I think we need both. We need to evaluate these transdisciplinary processes, the quality of these processes, but also some more social or transformation theoretically informed perspective on what kind of impact can we achieve with this. And finally, and this is also a practical challenge in the end, so to really do these co-evaluation together with practice, I think it requires these more long-term research infrastructures, because you need kind of the trust base to work together, a sense of shared responsibility and ownership of this, and of course also the longer-term projects to see these delayed or indirect effects taking place. Okay, thank you very much. Happy to discuss this.
Thank you. So thanks, Caroline. Also, thanks for introducing a bit the work of the day, because you can ask some questions now. We have a question round, like 10 minutes, so you can prepare your questions. But just to announce afterwards, after the 4 keynotes, we have small parallel working group tables where you will be able to discuss again more in depth. And we will come back to this question of evaluation. So we will work on evaluation of TD together, of transdisciplinarity research together in the small breaking groups. And then we will end by a panel session where the 4 keynotes will be invited for a final discussion, so you know a bit what the program is. And there's a cocktail in the end as well, so don't forget the networking cocktail. So, okay, so any questions for Caroline, please? The floor is yours now. It might work without microphone, or we have to distribute the microphone. You need a microphone for the streaming on YouTube. For the questions from the audience?
Thank you. Many thanks for the presentation. I'm Anne-Maud Courtois, working within the CITRA team here at the UCLouvain on the transition of food system. I was quite interested by the part you introduced about the framework for tracing the mechanism of change, and it seems quite closely linked to another framework that we use a lot and that has been growing in the literature about lock-ins. I don't know if you've looked at about that, but we use a lot the lock-ins, and all this idea of that system configuration have evolved through time to arrive to this dominant way, and it's really hard to dislodge it, and so studying the barriers. So it's a bit, really related to your mechanism of change. So I was wondering whether you looked into that literature and whether you found convergences with your framework, and or also how do you diverge from this literature of path dependency and lock-ins. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the question. I think the theoretical foundations and this basic kind of thinking about transitions or transformations and system stability is the same, and it's the same underlying foundations. I think what's different when I'd be interested to learn more about how you apply it, but when you think about path dependencies and lock-ins and all these systemic concepts, then you're looking at socio-technical systems like a food system. And what we try to do with the framework, that's why we work together with colleagues also from like spatial sciences and a psychologist, to really break this down to this level of these experiments and have these different dimensions to kind of have the dimensions that are typically relevant for these urban or just the real world labs, and to break it down a bit to be able to if you talk about lock-ins, you can of course specify it, but we try to find categories that reflect this kind of thinking of these structures and what's the potential for agency to change it, but break it down into these different spatial and actor level categories. But there's probably interesting research that you're working with, and I'm happy to learn about it.
Really nice, because in our team we are trying to use all this theory, but we're centering it around actors, and our question is really how do we start again from the actors instead of these, you said, really meta-level system, food system and so on.
Yeah, maybe one aspect on this, also the idea is when I talked about like context, how to delineate context and relevant context. If you I think like strong structuration approaches, then in this case we would start from the actors. So the actors involved in this problem and dealing with the problem, like asking them kind of what's the structural constraints you experience, what the structural aspects that enable you, and just start from their perspectives rather than defining objectively what the system boundaries are or the boundaries of this lab.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Sorry. Yes.
Thanks a lot, Caroline, for the presentation. I was wondering, I would like to get your reflections on the affordance of participating in something like that. Who can afford to spend the time and who cannot afford to spend the time? And how does that become a world for people who have the affordance to create the world they want to live in, about inequalities and things like that?
Very important question, and also something really not reflected enough on, or a new debate in this kind of field, because yeah, the projects I worked in, usually it's the usual suspects that contribute to these kinds of projects. I mean, there's, I think, organizational and very practical issues to think about. So what we did, of course, when we do workshops or stuff, do it in the evening, do it on the weekends. That's like the very small scale practical stuff to create or allow access for people from practice. But I think what you hinted at, the affordability, is much more about social inequalities and injustices, and this is, I think, something we haven't really figured out yet, and but is an important question, and happy to discuss this more.
Okay, so any follow-up questions? No, then I will give the floor to the next speaker, Olivier Couture, to follow on with another case study on TD research.
And it works. Presentations are in order. So I'm Olivier Couture. I'm a CNRS researcher in a research center in near Paris called LATS, for Laboratory Technologies, Territories and Societies. So I will make my presentation in English, but just for the sake of information, who does not understand French in this audience? Thank you. Okay, one, and one of our speakers as well. No, so that's fine. That's fine. It's yeah. Maybe we have also one online, but or maybe more, because maybe they're further away. But I'm always struck by this power of English, so to speak. Anyway, so my presentation is rather maybe a bit upstream from reflections on transdisciplinary research, but I will get to it in the end. So I'll try to get to the end as quick as possible. But just to say that what I will say is based on research that I've been carrying for past maybe 15 years on low carbon and energy transition strategies in the French capital region, Île-de-France. And I'm not trying to go through these 3 points, but the key question I will ask is, I will document on the limitations of dominant energy and low carbon transition approaches, and reflect on how can research, interdisciplinary research and possibly transdisciplinary research, help in moving beyond those limited approaches. So first a few words on low carbon policies and strategies in Île-de-France. Over the past 15 or 20 years, there has been an increasingly ambitious strategy developed, ambitious in terms of reducing the emissions of greenhouse gases, moving to renewable energies, and reducing energy consumption. All these 3 dimensions obviously are interconnected, and this has involved a very strong multi-sector strategy. That is, with the low carbon or energy transition strategy is developed in many public policy sectors, not surprisingly, energy generation, supply, transport, housing, digital infrastructures, and so on. But the starting point for the last research this presentation is based on, which I coordinated with Caroline Gallès, a colleague in Marne-la-Vallée, is that policies, low carbon or energy transition policies, struggle to keep to the very ambitious objectives that the strategies set for them. And what we observe still today, but what we observed at the beginning of that project, is that if the objectives set for 2050, so in 25 years time, were to be attained, the rhythm of decrease in greenhouse gas emissions, for example, as a key indicator, would have to be trebled 3 times as higher than what it has been in the in the past 15 years. So there's and this is a way to measure how lagging this policy delivery is. And so we were the project was trying to account for this failure to deliver the low carbon strategy. And so we set up an interdisciplinary project, not transdisciplinary, but interdisciplinary, but also in dialogue with actors, but not really transdisciplinary. We can discuss that later. But we developed an interdisciplinary research project with colleagues that are doing quantitative modeling and simulation of parts of those systems. So, for example, simulations of how the transport system and road traffic, for example, or use of public transport could evolve in the coming decades under this or that hypothesis. I'm a social scientist myself. I was trained as an engineer long ago, but I forgot nearly everything. But we work with engineers, and we're very much involved in quantitative modeling and simulation. Why did we do that? Because this research on low carbon transition policies has a very strong futuristic, in a way, framing. That is, we are asked as researchers to say things on how things could develop in the future, and in particular in the 25 coming years. And we are not very comfortable as social scientists to talk about the future, but some of our colleagues who develop models are much more comfortable. They make assumptions and they develop these models. And so the idea was that in a dialogue between the modelers and the social scientists, we might have more relevant things to say about how low carbon strategies and policies might develop in the future. What did we observe? Or what? We observed first that low carbon strategies rested primarily on massive investments in infrastructures in the domain of energy, with a very strong priority on district heating, which did not develop as fast as was hoped, but certainly involved a lot of investment. In transportation, there's a new set of public transit lines in the Paris region called Grand Paris Express, which represents really a massive investment. In high energy performance standards for new buildings, which increases their costs substantially, but also in energy renovation plans for existing buildings. But also, as I mentioned, in digital infrastructures. So, if you add those up, they are really massive investment today and in the coming years that are supposed to help or to be central in delivering these low carbon strategies. So this is what I refer to, and we can then talk a little more about this phrase later, as infrastructural solutionism. That is the idea that the problems raised by low carbon and energy transitions can be solved through mainly through infrastructural development. But going further into the study, what we observed is that there were very ambivalent orientations, and I briefly mentioned three examples, or evoked three examples. First is that these investments in infrastructural development were very siloed, that is very sector-based, rather than mutual or coordinated. And they were very much innovation-centered. That is, they put an emphasis on new technologies, new infrastructures, rather than, for example, making better use of existing infrastructures. The second strategic orientation is that these infrastructural developments allowed to promote at the same time the energy and low carbon strategy and the economic growth of growth strategy. Growth in terms of economic development, in terms of attractivity of the French capital region, and in terms also of physical growth, that is the expansion of the urban area. And the third strategic orientation was what I call the invisibilization of social practices, and I use the word cultural, maybe in a slightly different meaning than Caroline. For me, the cultural is more directly related to the ways of life and is reproduced in practices rather than being the more, what do you say, intellectual thinking, the thinking dimension of processes. But anyway, the infrastructural approach to energy and low carbon transitions allowed to not talk about the changes in social practices, ways of life, but also practices in organizations, practices in urban planning, for example, that would arguably be involved in the regional and actually in any real low carbon strategy. So it was a way of emphasizing the infrastructural side of the coin, was a way of avoiding to mention the other side of the coin, so to speak. I could spend a while, but I don't have time to comment on this picture. This is the French government's vision of the very near future, so that would be 2030, so in 5 years' time. I'll just show the drone-based agriculture, but anyway, it would take a long time to comment. But I think just the picture gives an idea of the kind of image they have in how our governance see the energy and ecological transition. And the next step in the reflection then is to say why is this infrastructural solutionism put forward? And I already evoked that briefly. First, it allows to avoid debates and conflicts. That is, by responding to issues of decarbonization by adding yet another layer of infrastructure, then you can avoid many debates and conflicts on alternative ways, so to speak, of delivering these strategies. And second, it facilitates what we call painless arbitrations. They are not really painless for everybody, but they are painless in the sense that they, as Karina mentioned, many of the effects of transformative change, and in this case transition strategies, are indirect, remote, delayed, and out of sight, so to speak. So by developing the infrastructural environment, you give the impression that every social interest can be satisfied when in fact there are negative implications, but they are out of sight for a while at least. And the third and important virtue, so to speak, or quality or characteristic of infrastructural solutionism is that it renders unthinkable and unthinkable what I call policies of less. That is, it's a kind of Lampedusan trick, so to speak. If you know the famous phrase of Lampedusa, everything has to change so that nothing changes, and there's a bit of that in infrastructural solutionism. That is, be assured that if we develop these new layers of infrastructures, you can keep on doing what you've been doing all along. And this you is ordinary people and in their ordinary ways of life, but it's also obviously economic actors in their development strategies. But this does not come without a cost, and the cost and the costs appear at least in two ways. First, this biased or this partially blind approach comes with how can I say? Deteriorates the longer-term efficiency of low-carbon policies. If you, for example, if you develop even new public transit infrastructure without thinking of what people will do with increased capacity to move around, what you arrive at is that more people will move around longer distances, and the urban area will grow because there will be possibilities to live further away from the urban center, and if you do not include that in the reflection at the beginning, then in the longer term the efficiency of low carbon policies is deteriorated. And another important dimension is the dimension of social spatial justice. I don't have time really to elaborate on that, but in a way the depoliticization is not a good word, but the lack of debate on the real choices that should be made about energy or low carbon transition strategies results in increased social spatial injustice, in more gentrification, in more exposure to pollutants in some parts of the city, not always the most privileged. Which led us to the conclusion that, which is not so original, but which is important nevertheless, that if we want to have, what is the word, the terms used in the conference, just, pluralist and sustainable transformations, they need to go through what we call democratic politics, that is the public deliberation of collective choices. So far, I've talked about this interdisciplinary research that has helped understand the delivery gap in low-carbon policies in Ile-de-France, the longer-term and indirect limitations of those policies, and the political factors that, in fact, are at the core of these limitations. And I would like to briefly conclude in 1 or 2 minutes with only questions, which, I mean, if you have the answers, that will help me certainly, but it's the kind of questions we ask ourselves. The overarching question is: can research and researchers help moving beyond these limitations? That is, beyond the infrastructural solutionism and its limitations. And I evoked 4 figures of researcher contributions to more democratic politics, so to speak, of low carbon and energy transition policies. But each of them have their weaknesses. So the first one would be, we could expect, in a sort of a Habermasian perspective, we could expect researchers to promote, with others of course, but to promote an ethos of rational, fact-based and non-offensive democratic conversation. Well, first, these days academics among themselves are not always non-offensive, and but it's a minor argument compared to the fact that rational and so-called fact-based conversations struggle to structure public debates in the current context, and maybe not only for bad reasons. Second role that researchers might have would be to define, or to help define, to contribute to define what is at stake in collective choices. So at least to agree on the problems, even if we do not agree, if all stakeholders do not agree on the solutions. And this is where maybe transdisciplinary research might be most useful. The thing is, with whom do you do transdisciplinary research when you work on energy or low carbon transition? If you work with large energy firms or large infrastructure firms, it's one way of doing it, but it brings you to specific outcomes. And if you want to do with residents, inhabitants, population, then it's very often difficult, because people, in fact, are not interested in carbon or energy. They're interested in their energy bill, and they might be interested in other aspects of ecological transitions, in the quality of local environment, in the quality of food, in that kind of stuff. But mobilizing, or seeing people mobilizing themselves around issues of energy or carbon, in fact, it's not happening really to a significant extent in our observations, but maybe you have different experiences. The third approach would be to help understand that there is more to infrastructures than infrastructures, because and to make more obvious the fact that infrastructures are related to what we call organized practices. That is, it is only within a context of practices that or infrastructures make sense or do not make sense, and so reflect on these interactions and also other aspects which I don't have time to develop. And finally, it's more poetic, but I think it's important as well. Researchers of all kinds may arguably help reopen futures beyond the solutions, or the dominant solutions that are always brought forward in terms of energy and low carbon transitions. Sorry, I was a bit long. Hope it was
not at all. Not at all. Thank you very much. So that's really about the movement from interdisciplinary to transdisciplinary. And as we know in our university as well, we very often try first to build this interdisciplinary capacity before going to the social actors, because when we work with the social actors, we quickly realize that they have much more knowledge than we at university. So it's important that we are quite
more knowledge, and also their problems are not structures according to disciplinary boundaries. So if we want to be able to interact with them, we need a broader range of expertise than each of us individually has, I think.
Yes. So we have some energy experts in the room, and other people who from urban studies who are surely ready to ask some questions.
Thanks. If I have the time, I have 3 questions, so I might reduce them if I don't. First, I have a question about the word infrastructure. I think it's rather broad. When you discussed it and you gave an example, it was about, for example, road or commuting or transport infrastructure. But what I see is also other infrastructure enabling renewable energies, for example, storage of energy, transport of energy. And I think some of those are enablers and would help the penetration of renewables, and others would not help and make what you said about the possibility of doing less, the sufficiency, those technology would stop us going to the sufficiency. So I'd like to know where you put the boundaries of what you call this infrastructure solutionism.
Yes, so good question, certainly. So yeah, I use infrastructures in a relatively broad sense of a networked technical infrastructures, large transport or energy networks, but also the built environment sort of way acts as part of as an infrastructure, as part of an infrastructure. So in my view, when you invest, if you invest, which does not always happen, but if you invest in energy renovation, massive energy renovation of buildings, of housing, for example, that's also an infrastructural investment. And I'm not sure I grasped entirely your argument about infrastructures that allow the development of renewable energies. I put this slide again because it's striking that it gives you the impression of a self-sufficient community. You can see the energy is produced in the sea and in the windmills and etc. And but it's hardly believable that the plane that we can see that flies across the sky would be fueled with the windmills that are around. So there is a my area of expertise is more networked infrastructure, and there is a very strong property of large technological network to hide, in fact, the entire metabolic chain that helps the functioning of most for example, urban systems. So the idea that, for example, there is a lot of talk about electrification today as a key element in energy transitions, but the reflection on electricity is always made in, the reasonings are already made in final energy and never in primary energy, because if you look at the primary energy involved in producing the electricity that you then want to use in energy transition, it changes the metabolic view, so to speak, entirely. And also the geography of these systems, because where the resources are extracted from is usually far away from where it is transformed for final use. Anyway, I don't know if it answers to your question.
I think, if I have the time, I think this is precisely my point. We have about 80% of our energy coming from fossil fuel. If we have to move and displace this fossil energy, we have to use some sort of infrastructure that is completely different from today's infrastructure. So I think there is part of the infrastructure that is required to access this new form of energy. And my second question was related to that, actually. It's because while we wait, there is an opportunity cost in terms of emission. We continue to emit. So the second question is, should we fight against a system that is anyway, I mean, you know the saying, we can imagine the end of the world easier than the end of capitalism. So should we, I mean, go against the machine, or should we go along and just avoid these opportunity costs in terms of emissions?
Yeah, well, as all things regarding the future, it's difficult to make a assured forecast, but my personal intuition is that going along will not make it, will not be enough. So at some point there will be massive forms of reshuffling, not a massive reshuffling, but massive forms of reshuffling. And the less they are anticipated, the more they will be violent for a majority of people. But on the other hand, I also agree that things have to be done now. But what my presentation argues is that if you the dominant approach is too one-sided, and because these sufficiency approaches, to use a very broad terms, do not make any obvious profit, financial profit. They are invisibilized, and so this also has a giant opportunity cost, in my understanding.
Maybe a last point. You mentioned people gather around energy, not being really present. I'm not sure it's a relevant example, and I'm not sure if you looked into it, but I've heard a lot of social science research around energy communities, and there are good things, less good things. I don't know if this is relevant for what you discussed at the very end.
Yeah, it would be relevant. I don't pretend I know everything of energy communities. My experience is that it often involves people who very specific profiles of people who have a strong interest in technical issues, in technical stuff, and maybe not representative of a broader population, but certainly it's part of the picture. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. We will have time to continue the discussion on the round tables. So I would like to invite our next speaker. It's very loud. So Madeleine Akrich, and I just want to underline that by doing this conference year after year, we are very happy that we broaden the field. So Madeleine will speak about also the case of knowledge in biomedical research, knowledge from the medical field. So we have speakers that work on energy, on urban studies, but also from the medical side today.
Okay, hello everybody. Okay, sorry. I'm not sure I will be as good as they have been. Because I was, you know. So unlike the previous speakers, I'm going to sit because it's very difficult for me to keep the time when I'm not sticking to my notes. So, and it would be difficult for me to manage the microphone, the remote sensor, and my notes. So I'm going to sit. I want first to thank the organizers for inviting me, and I'm very interested into discussing this notion of transdisciplinary research, which is quite new for me, even if I have been working for some years on the role of patient organization in the production of knowledge. So I will give you a number of examples. I feel that these people are doing transdisciplinary research, but they don't call that this way. Well, we will have the opportunity to discuss this afterwards. So, to begin with, I would like to return to the definition of terms like such as the experiential knowledge and experiential expertise, which are in the title of my presentation. These terms were forged by Thomasina Bockmann in 1976, so it's quite old, as part of her research on Alcoholic Anonymous. So in the 90s, the dominant paradigm about alcoholism was that it was due to a lack of will, and that the electroshock was the best therapy. So a few alcoholics who had observed the ineffectiveness of this treatment began to meet together and to discuss, and they found that the addictive nature of alcohol was a problem. So together, they imagined an alternative treatment based on the 12 steps, very famous 12 steps of the Alcoholics Anonymous. So they drew on their experience, but according to Bockmann, it's only by comparing their different experiences that they were able to grasp what was happening to them and to understand the common features of this shared experience. So what I want to point out here is the fact that there is a gap between individual experience and experiential knowledge and expertise. So at the individual level, unless there is a reflexive elaboration, experience is just isolated, unorganized bits of facts and feeling, to borrow from Bockmann. The construction of experiential knowledge involves analysis of data representing experiences such as testimonies, data collected on helpline, answers to surveys, and a collective elaboration, and that's the important point. And experiential expertise involves a further level of elaboration. It is based on the application of experiential knowledge to find solutions to problems faced by the people who are concerned by the disease. So alongside this notion of experiential expertise, we have also seen the emergence of a different form of expertise, which is in the domain of medicine called lay expertise. It appeared in particular in relation to AIDS activists and rare disease associations, and it refers to the ability of this non-professional to acquire and master scientific and medical knowledge in order to be able to interact with professionals and researchers. So the first point I would like to make is that the internet has played a major role in the development of these forms of expertise. On the one hand, it has made it easier to access the scientific literature and to circulate it. And on the other hand, the development of mail groups, forums, Facebook groups has allowed people to exchange on a very broad scale and in a written format, which makes it really easier to collect and to process data. And this tendency has been taken a little further with the development of survey applications that are in fact accessible to everyone. So just on these two next slides, I just put examples of the numerous surveys carried out by patient organizations during the COVID-19 pandemic. So the first slide concerns surveys on the impact of the pandemic on medical care for various pathologies, and the second one is on the impact on respect for patients' rights. My second point is that what we consider today as experiential knowledge is often actually a hybrid construction, which is mixing in various ways and proportions elements from people's experience and elements from scientific and medical knowledge. So in the early 2000s, with colleagues, I studied a number of mail groups like Yahoo groups, and we observed quite a lot of genre mixing. I mean, people who came to seek explanations or advice about their health problems began not only to share their experience, but also to circulate scientific articles and other sort of publications. And they use all this literature to make sense of their experiences and to build a shared vision of what was problematic for them and for people with the disease in general. So it could be, some of the problems could be the ignorance on the part of decision makers and or professionals about various aspects of living with a disease. It could be also the organization of care. It could be issues that had not been yet addressed by research. It was a kind of problematization work which was at stake in these groups, and this work has often led to the creation of patient organizations. There are many associations in France and elsewhere that have emerged from such groups. And as a result, the movement has been accompanied by a renewal in the forms of engagement of patient organizations, leading to what my colleagues and I have called evidence-based activism. Because by this we mean activism that relies heavily on the production of knowledge, particularly based on the experiences of affected people, both to identify priorities for action, to develop adapted responses, and to develop advocacy. So this kind of work helps these groups to be heard by decision makers and health professionals, because first, when they produce experiential knowledge, they borrow some methods and characteristics from scientific or professional ways of producing knowledge. And secondly, they are able to articulate experiential knowledge and credentialed knowledge. So now I'm going to take a few examples to make things more concrete. And the first example I'm taking concerns the French ADHD association, which is called Hyper Super. It was created in the 2000s by a group of people who met on a forum in a context where ADHD wasn't really taken seriously in France. It was considered as an American invention. And in the early days of their existences, they provided support through email groups, meetings and helplines, and they collected many testimonies which they used on their website. After a while, they decided to launch a major survey on the path to diagnosis, the care children receive, comorbidities, the children's difficulties in daily life, and the problems they encounter at school. This resulted in the poster you can see on the slide, which has been presented at a medical conference. The first author you can see is Christine Gétin, which is the president of Hyper Super, and it has been co-signed by some professional allies. So the result of these surveys were used to ask the High Authority for Health, which is the equivalent of NICE in France, to produce recommendations for primary care when faced with a child or a young person who may have an attention deficit disorder, and later recommendation for diagnosis and treatment. So as you can see, it has been asked by the patient organizations, and they have to produce a kind of argument to explain why these recommendations are necessary, and they drew upon the survey they did before. It has also been used to argue that ADHD should be considered a form of disability. Hyper Super allied with some sister organizations concerned with learning and developmental disabilities, which are often associated with ADHD. Maybe you have seen that on the previous slide. And together they brought the notion of cognitive disability to the fore. To make this concept workable, they developed with some doctors and specialists a medical description of ADHD, which is based on neuroscientific knowledge, and then they translated the description into the language of the ICF, the International Classification of Functioning, Disability and Health. So it implied combining scientific knowledge on the one hand and with, on the other hand, experiential knowledge of what the disorder actually does to children, such as learning difficulties, poor relationships with others, difficulty in getting organized, and so on and so forth. So this example, I think the ADHD example, shows how experiential knowledge takes different form, resulting from specific work and tailored to particular situation. At the beginning of the association, it was a series of testimonies, and taken together, these testimonies created a shared vision of what life is like for children with ADHD and their parents, which helped to create a collective mobilization. Then the survey provides a more organized vision by separating the different issues and treating them in a statistical way, which makes it possible to initiate a dialogue with professionals as well as with administrations such as the HAS in order to produce changes in care organization. And then the work on the description of ADHD as a disability obliged the association to combine elements from shared experiences with neurologic pedagogical concept in order to produce an analysis of activity limitation and restriction in daily life. And this analysis is the basis on which are determined the compensation measures that may be applicable to each ADHD child on the basis of his or her personal situation. So that's we see how experiential knowledge may be used in order to produce changes in care. What you see on this slide are photos which are taken from films made by the De Kepper family, who were behind the creation of the AIFM, the French Association Against Muscular Dystrophy, and who had 4 children affected with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. At the time the films were made, they represented the most accurate knowledge of the disease and made it possible to describe the natural history of the disease. At that time, nobody was interested in the disease, except parents, and the only advice doctors gave to parents was not to get too attached to their children because they were going to die quite shortly. So this is a case where you see that experiential knowledge formed the basis of the knowledge. Yes. Well, that's okay. Of the knowledge about disease, and there are other cases, for example, emerging or contested diseases such as chronic fatigue syndrome, and also diseases that may be linked to environmental pollution. In other cases, patients can highlight an unknown aspect of the disease, and I will take the example of the French association, which is called Generation 22, which has been created in 1998 on a chromosomal syndrome called 22q11 deletion syndrome. There exists today a consensus on the complexity of this syndrome, which is characterized by multiple organic, cognitive, and psychiatric disorders. But at that time, before the 2000s, depending on the most prominent sign, the disease had actually different names. In fact, they were considered as different diseases. So the mother who founded the association recalled that the clinician she visited at that time argued that her child's various disorders were in no way related to each other. It took her years to assemble facts on the complexity of the condition, collecting and confronting families' experience to existing scientific and medical literature. And interestingly, it was family, not specialists, who alerted the association and scientists about the coincidence of schizophrenia in this syndrome, which led the association to participate to the psychiatric genetics research on this topic. So we see that in this case, experiential knowledge is not only brought in original observations, it also contributed a paradigmatic change in the understanding of the syndrome, which was previously scattered between different and unrelated corpus of scientific and medical knowledge. And again, we can see the boundary between experiential knowledge and academic knowledge is somewhat blurred to the point that experiential knowledge can provide the foundation upon which academic knowledge is built. The last example concerns CIAN, which is the main French cyber organization. It was created in 2003 from several smaller and formal and informal organizations. Some of them were web-based that shared a common concern about what they saw as an excessive medicalization of childbirth. In 2004, CIAN was asked to review the guidelines on the prevention of postpartum hemorrhage. The aim of these guidelines, seen from the perspective of doctors, was to take into account the latest research and to promote the injection of oxytocin immediately after birth in order to provoke strong uterine contraction that close the blood vessels. From its anti-medicalization position, Sian criticized the way prevention was defined in the guidelines as in fact a form of intervention and not really prevention, and the fact that there wasn't any reflection on the potential risk factors. France was quite a special case. The proportion of hemorrhage among causes of death in women was significantly higher than in other countries, and the proportion of women receiving oxytocin to speed up labor was also very high. But Sian was the only actor establishing a link between these two facts. Why was that? Sian was particularly concerned about this intervention because it had a significant impact on the birth process, increasing contraction and then pain and leading to further medicalization, which they felt was detrimental to the birth experience. Putting these two facts together, rate of hemorrhage in cause of death and rate of oxytocin use, they began to wonder whether the administration of oxytocin during labor might increase postpartum hemorrhage, their intuition being that it might saturate receptors that inhibit the response to the natural release of oxytocin after birth. So they persuaded the French health insurance system to fund research on the subject, which concluded that they were right. So that this is a publication that is issued from this research. So it led to completely new guidelines and a radically different approach in the use of oxytocin in France. So what we are seeing here is how a different perspective on care based on experience leads to the raising of scientific questions that scientists don't ask themselves because they are locked into a different frame of thinking. And in a stance, their critical stance enables them to grasp the situated nature of biomedical knowledge and to make other proposals that are equally situated but that may have some scientific relevance. Of course, this presupposes that the people in the association have the capacity to appropriate the scientific literature and to put in dialogue with experiential knowledge. So to conclude very briefly, I want to emphasize again that it's very important to have in mind the collective nature of experiential knowledge, to have in mind also its close relationship with credentialed knowledge and in its role in moving the boundaries of how illness is defined, how care is provided, how care is organized, what research questions should be investigated, etc., etc. For the time now, from some time now, the notion of experiential knowledge has been very much in the forefront in the field of health, but sometimes there is a temptation to approach experiential knowledge through direct contact with individuals without the mediation of groups and associations which are considered as biased. One of the points I want to make here is that it is precisely because they are biased, that they have a specific point of view, that they are able to propose new things and to advance knowledge that is useful for them and medicine in general. Thank you.
So thank you very much. So we had the previous presenter who showed how you can make things invisible. And I think this presentation tried to do the reverse, how to show how the invisible can become visible. So thanks very much. So the floor is open for questions. Yes. The usual suspects there. So I don't know, perhaps something there.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I have a question about the fact that when there are doctors, when there are patients' associations, there can also be power relations between these groups. And I wanted to know if you had experienced some cases where patients' organizations felt used or manipulated or instrumentalized by doctors, and also where there are real conflicts. I am in a research on, I don't know how you call that in English, violence obstétricale, and there are really not, there's no agreement on the definition, neither if it's a scientific concept, and so there is a competition on the concept, and the stakeholders in the research do not agree on what is the scientific production they should deliver. Thank you.
Well, of course there are power relations and conflicts. I think that in France we are helped by the existence of the 2002 law, which is called the Kouchner law, which imposes that in many, I would say most medical committees, there should be patient representatives sitting in this committee, and these patient representatives are supposed to be from various patient organizations, not people just, you know. And so I think that, well, they are forced to take into account their advice. It's not very easy, especially in the obstetrical world, which is extremely, which was extremely, I don't know how to say that, but masculinist or something like that, with very strong domination relationships between the different actors. From doctors vis-à-vis midwives, professionals vis-à-vis women, etc. I think that on the topic of the obstetrical violence, it's still a fight. And very recently, Sian has made an answer to a publication which was on a scientific journal about. It was about the idea that you shouldn't use the term violence, that you should use bad practices or something like that. And so they just made a comment to say, yes, we need to call it violence. So it's still a fight, but I mean, things are progressing. So I'm rather optimist, but maybe I shouldn't, but I think it's okay.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I had a few questions, but I'll only say one now. It was about the last point that you made about who speaks and on whose behalf, who's biased, who's not. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts or reflections about that point on who do we invite to the table when we discuss knowledge, experiential knowledge, and also the evidence-based activism. And I'm just one example from the field of disability and mental health in France. I think there's a friction, a tension between the experiential knowledge of parents and of children who experience a disability. So whose experiential knowledge counts and why?
Well, I think that in the case you are mentioning, I think that both experiential knowledge may count. I guess that sometimes I would say that sometimes medical professional can try to use one group against the other. So promoting, for example, children experience might be a way to contradict parents' experience, but I think that all experiences are interesting, and we have done some time ago a European project on this kind of issue, and for example in the UK they did some as regards Alzheimer. The organizations were concerned by the fact that it was always family or carers that were speaking instead of the concerned people, and so they try to invent a way of having them involved into this speech, even if they cannot speak. So they had a kind of methods with images and things like that in order to have people express their feelings. So depending on the case, you can have quite innovative methods.
So thanks. I think we can continue this discussion. I give the floor to Ulrike Feld from Vienna for the last presentation.
Okay, here we are. And I grab, does it work? Okay, so good afternoon. I'm the last before the break, so I would kindly ask you to give me a 5-minute sign so that I can kind of nicely manage that. At the background of this slide, you see a publicity piece from the European Union towards a green and digital future. And I would like to speak a bit about that topic, because much of what has been shown in Olivier's talk, but also in the question of a super infrastructure that is being layered out over everything we do is the digital infrastructuring. And I would like to talk about that. And the title says, whose problems, whose solutions? And it's for me really to address this tension between digital transformation and environmental sustainability, which is a big issue in the kind of public discourse around that. And in particular, I'm interested in posing the question of how can we intervene and where are the moments of intervention when these kind of big infrastructures are rolled out. And how do power distributions look like? And what kinds of interdisciplinarity or what kinds of formats of transdisciplinary collaboration might matter. This is definitely not for one format, because I will argue why working with infrastructures is such an interesting thing. But that's roughly the 1-minute summary of what I will be showing too. So I start with some observations. And I will stay in Europe and particularly also look at the European commissions and the European policy discourse. Why? Because many national contexts actually align along these things, and therefore it's not uninteresting to see what kind of language, what kind of metaphors, pictures, expectations are being steered by these conversations. So first of all, we have shifted from knowledge to innovation, and that's a really important point to keep in mind. We don't speak about knowledge economy or knowledge infrastructures, we speak about innovation. The second is we have moved, with a European self-imagination, we have moved towards an ever more comprehensive vision of a digital decade. When you look all the action plans and papers that have been published over the last years, 3-4 years, it's amazing when you bring them to the table and look at them. The practices of collecting and storing, so it's nicely called banking, data have been firmly established and extremely positively connotated activities in science and society. How many people have started to watch their bodies and to count the steps and to count the pulse and to count how, you don't know how you slept, you need to ask your wristwatch how it was. Generally, I tend to know when I creep out of my bed that I don't need the watch to tell me that it was bad. So what we see here is what Schipper and Schott have very nicely called infrastructural Europeanism. It's a conceptual frame to investigate the co-production of a specific version of Europe, European citizens, and digital infrastructures. And in that sense, we could also speak, and this is a very interesting concept to think of, infrastructural citizenship. That's a concept developed in the context of urban planning, actually. And it's really interesting to expand that and to think how we might think of the digital infrastructures as creating a particular kind of citizenship with rights and duties, etc., of collecting data, of donating data, of being generous with your data in order to feed a kind of meta structure. But it's also, of course, about the future. Oops. Aha. Your computer has eaten my Apple slides. There is a whole bunch of nice text here. Okay. Bad. Can you do something about that? That this computer eats it's a Microsoft dominance over Apple. I think this is unfair. Yeah. The first one. Yeah, here it is, you see? Okay. And now he eats it again? No. Thank you. That's great, because I wanted that quote. I like it really very much, because I think that translates the spirit. Repairing the world of today by shaping the world of tomorrow. And I think this is a very interesting vision. And then tomorrow we will repair the shape of yesterday and the society of yesterday with the digital technologies of tomorrow. But now let's get into these details. But I want not to stick with the phrasing, but to stick with the mentality of that we live in a continuous loop of repairing what we've in the first place have put digitally in place, or not only digitally in place. So the pressing question is, who develops these future visions? And from which perspective, so through which glasses? And whose voices are actually heard at the end of the day? Where and when is an opportunity for intervention and asking questions about means and ends? And I would like to quote Michel Calon and co-authors here, if the end justifies the mean, only debate can justify the end. So the question is, why do we want a full-fledged digital world, and in which ways is it better? And what kind of, I call it, threat solution or problem solution packages are being made in order to make us see these things as unavoidable. The threat, for example, is totally unexpectedly we have an aging population. That's total hot news from print. We have an aging population. They want treatment and healthcare, also totally unexpected. And they cost a lot to the system, and therefore they threaten our balance, our healthcare balance. And this is why we need digital in order to cater for this problem of age. And it's so interesting to look what threatens us and what is then the solution that has to come with that threat. And what kind of future and whose future is being imagined and drives these developments. So, and then of course for me interesting is where and when is something like transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary research called for, asking questions and developing different futures. And it's important also asking the questions is for me, and I think Olivier has already pointed to that, it's not just bringing the solutions. Are we asking the right questions? Are we questioning the infrastructures we should question? And I think it has quite nicely been already picked up by, for example, in Evgeny Morotov's book, To Save Everything, Click Here. So in a sense, this idea that the digital will actually be the solution, but the critique would be it is a digital solutionism. So in a sense that we think that's the only way we can get out of this problematic. Now, a bit to my background, I have been working in several areas around more participation issues. And in particular, two projects I would underline. The first is in the health area, where I've participated in the creation of, in a project that promised to create, I have to be prudent what I'm saying exactly, a project that promised, a European project that promised to create a health data bank, a health data repository which citizens could take along when they go across European countries. That was the kind of basic idea. And we as social scientists were meant to work to create spaces of co-creation between the tech developers and the people that would be the imagined potential users. I could spend a day talking about what worked and what didn't work, but I won't do that today. But it is a really interesting question what it means to participate in these kinds. And it's an infrastructure, and that's why I mentioned that today here. It's very different to work on co-creation things that are not infrastructures in comparison to infrastructures, because they are extended in space and time in a specific way, and they matter very differently in specific moments and in specific places. So it's very complex to know where to go and where to sit down and who should be the ones that are involved in the creation. And that's, for me, the kind of real challenge that became visible. And the second is the smart city components, where it was more about imaginations of participation versus participation. And we looked in particular at Smart City Vienna. It's very proud of its participatory formats and of its citizen engagements. And it was fascinating to see how much the problem was first created by those who offered the solutions. And then the citizens didn't come and didn't recognize the problems and therefore didn't use the solutions. And then these things did not actually work out so well. So this meeting the problems and the solutions was actually the problem. Now, I will take you to a different world in which I'm right now stuck, and I was thinking that this audience would be a great audience to maybe discuss certain of these issues. And I take you to my ERC grant, which I have started a bit more, nearly 2 years ago. It's called Innovation Residues, Modes and Infrastructures of Caring for Our Long-Durée Environmental Futures. And I'm asking mainly how contemporary societies conceptualize and make sense of, live with, and care for what I call residues. And residues is all that is left over in a process of innovation. So from the things at the end that stay, like microplastics is a residue to plastic industry. And I have 3 fields which I try to compare, because I'm not interested in the particular micro cases. I'm interested in how big fields of innovation actually promise a particular world to bring it into being, not thinking about the collateralities that they create, in particular through overflows like microplastic and plastic. Plastic promised a world that is clean and colorful, and it's democratic. It was also because everybody could buy everything as often as he or she wanted. And at the end of the day, we are now confronting serious problems, environmentally speaking, which we now need to repair with a lot of money and problems. The other one is the nuclear, where I'm not interested in high-level waste. I'm more interested in low and mid-level waste, because I think high-level waste goes so much beyond our imagination that it's difficult to handle it, and mid and low-level waste is something like 300 years, which would theoretically be thinkable, but which we still have great difficulties to actually think it and do it. And the final one I want to speak today about is the digital and what I call digital waste and wasting. And so we have developed concepts and thinking like responsible research and innovation. So this idea that we need to better care for, be more inclusive and context sensitive. We need co-creation and co-design. And this focus on early on integration in emerging fields of innovation, but also growing regulatory efforts. But it's fascinating to observe our love for the early phase, not wanting to consider anything that comes after. So it's about really this moment of creation that we are really passionately in love with. And then the rest is more strategic ignorance, I would say, towards end of life or afterlives of innovations, the collateral realities these innovations create, like, as I said, microplastic, etc. Now, I want particularly to speak about the digital transition, and these pictures are all taken from European web pages. This promise that there will be nature and technology, nature and culture will kind of merge into one. And it's immensely interesting to look at the visual discourse of how everywhere suddenly green leaves grow in computers and similar things. I'm happy that mine doesn't do that, but just as a small remark. And I'm interested in what kinds of residues are being directly or indirectly produced. I would like to know if the green has become the new fig leaf in the it's a nice for many of these kind of technological innovations. And really what bugs me most is how to intervene in that world in a way that creates an understanding, and what are the actors that would need to come together, and in which ways, and where are the loopholes where one could actually kind of argue towards that. And when Olivier was asked what is an infrastructure for you, because you use this notion of infrastructure, I think we have to think more, even one layer more complex about these infrastructures. And when I study the European policy documents, it's very obvious, and also the discourses people give, it's obvious that these infrastructures are layered. They only one layer is a digital or a physical layer. But there's another one, namely a narrative infrastructure. So we have standard stories which circulate and which are very powerful to make people believe that that's the only future we have, and therefore we have to buy into it. And the third thing, it's a thinking infrastructures, because you teach people that the only knowledge they can have about themselves, about the world, about economy, about anything is through data. And I think this is really important to consider, that we unlearn, or we invite people to unlearn, to have other sensitivities towards the world around them. And the data become as the spokesperson for whatever it is, your body, your economy, your urban environment, whatever. So that is something I think is really important to consider. And then I tried to dissect, to make an autopsy what a digital network would look like. And I would like to take you through the 5 stages and then end with a question like, where do we start to, that's perfect, where do we start to intervene? So so I put all these devices that we all have in many forms, from the phone to the computer, so the ordinary devices. I don't even need the supercomputer whatsoever. Now, we have a lot of digital practices, and we collect and store, and we create what I call data bodies, and these data bodies need to be kept alive. And that means they need electricity, they need water, and they need rare materials, rare earths, in order to be able to stay alive. So data they are dying if you do not do that. You cannot use them again. And so it's important not only that they're alive, but that they can travel, and that whenever you do a search, you leave additional traces, data traces on the web, etc. So there's a continuous collection of data and the growth of it. And here you see some estimations of that. And we have by now approximately 5.35 billion internet users in 2024. We create 328 million terabytes of data, generated, captured, copied, consumed every day. And I think this is this is only the start, because there are many, many more enterprises that add to that. So here I want to say, I want to make aware that data that are not used or not usable because of their quality are waste. They are nothing else than other kind of waste that we produce, and we have no waste strategies. And just think of your personal, how many pictures we take with mobile phones and store them somewhere and never look at them anymore. And of course, individually, this does not matter when you add it up with 5.35 billion internet users that take just one picture a day. Okay, I leave you there. But I then, in order for these data to be kept alive, I need data centers. And that is interesting, because data centers need substantive and growing amounts of energy, water, and critical raw materials. And here you have a lot of, in Spain, there's a big movement against data centers, dry land for thirsty data. Or you have the carbon and the cloud, in a sense, or the cloud dries my river. So there are a lot of citizen movements actually creating around data centers, trying to understand what's going on here. And this is something that is really important. For example, in Ireland, one of the case studies in Ireland, about 20% of the energy is going into data centers right now, which means that the electricity grid is unstable. And who gets priority? Of course, the data center, because they cannot have unstable grids. So you know what it means. In the US, you had a so-called green data center, so electricity from environmentally friendly produced current. Just the town next to it had to open up the coal facility again in order to have enough. Or you need a couple of more nuclear power plants. One can discuss that too. Okay. Then we move on and we say, where do these materials come from? And here I'm particularly critical against Europe, because actually rare earth mining is one of the dirtiest businesses, environmentally speaking, that we have. And as every extraction of this size, it produces a lot of waste in that sense. And it's particular here, I think, we have in Europe developed this study on critical raw materials for the European Union, have then a regulation for the raw material. And I think with the Raw Material Act and the CHIPS Act, it frames the challenges mainly as a question of access to resources, so of material sovereignty, and not as an environmental problem to be cared for. And this is a new form of resource colonialism that we are starting here. That means, of course, we pay for the material, but we also want to have that extracted in other countries and not in our own kind of environment. And then I move on, and I move on to e-waste, which more recently there has been legal regulations that you need informed consent for the import of e-waste, but nobody knows how that really works. But we know that most of the Western or the Northern Hemisphere e-waste lands in the Southern Hemisphere, and this is also a form of waste colonialism, as this colleague of mine names very aptly. Europe is particularly a high producer, and this because we throw away a lot of this material. You see Norway, United Kingdom, Switzerland, France is number 4, proudly, in producing 22.4 kilo per capita of electronic waste of diverse kinds. And of course, this goes to a developing country, and we have all seen these movies, etc. Now, if I continue to the last, we have developed a new extractive industry. Extractive industries, there is none that has been environmentally friendly so far, so also the digital extraction industry is not environmentally friendly and is not sustainable by any means. And so the point here is, for example, this is the European Commission's project, Destination Earth. The idea is to have a full-fledged digital twin model of the Earth, and with that be able to kind of manipulate and play and experiment. Cities have twins, like Rotterdam has a twin. We start to twin human bodies, etc. But that means in reality data, massive amounts of new data that we are creating every day, which would need to be balanced against the promise that it will help us to better manage energy, to better manage agriculture, etc., etc. In your picture, Olivier, where you showed this idea of drones and agriculture, it's unbelievable what kinds of data are produced there, what infrastructure is needed to do that. And so, of course, there can be gains. So I'm not saying that this might not kind of improve certain things, but it also creates damages on the other side. So the question is, who makes the balance? And here I'm in the middle of my question, actually, and this is my last slide. It's unclear how the long term is imagined in a sustainable manner beyond tropes of digital solutionism. There is no assessment, proper assessment that is being done of the impacts this has on the environment. The only promise is that it will help solve the climate change, because we have all these observational materials. But it does not reflect on the fact that in order to be able to do that, we need to have a lot of resources go into that. We have a residual absence in that sense in policy thinking versus a residual multiplicity in practice. So the residues are absent in the policy, they are totally present when you look at it. Just think of it. You have residual data, so data that you don't need, and they kept alive. You have what I call mediated residues, for example, nuclear waste. If I need to open up a nuclear power plant to run my data center, then I produce waste, maybe not directly by the data center, we have extraction residues. We have infrastructural residues, so all these data centers that will have to be kind of dismantled and renewed. We have digital waste, and we have CO2 that is massively produced by these infrastructures. So where, when, and in which constellation is it still possible to intervene here with the necessity of different inter- and transdisciplinary constellations? It's really interesting. Of course, this is not something that you can put on hold, but how can we enter this debate without leaving this image of the clean, unproblematic way of managing our lives, our world, our environments? And that's the big question. And who would have to be at the table? And in our project, we are working it together a lot also with people who build these things, with protested against data centers, and we try for the time being in a way to understand the different standpoints to the problem in order to think about whom would one need to bring to the table. But as this is a global infrastructure and not just a kind of local thing where you could identify who is the user, etc., that is a real problem. And many cases where transdisciplinary collaboration or interdisciplinary collaboration works better is when the problems are localized, when you can identify where things happen and who might be touched by what. In the data case, we do not see who has the gain. It's invisible who has the gain and who has the damages. This is made invisible, so it is not invisible, it's made invisible. And I think that could be one task to kind of extract and make this visibility present. And is it repair or is it design? And I think the quote I gave from the European Union to say we repair yesterday's problem with tomorrow's future in a way is an interesting question. And under which conditions can we uphold the dream of the extended lives of ever more accumulating and traveling data? And that's a question which I have done a lot of interviews asking people about how they imagine that, and I've gotten not a single satisfactory answer, except that in the future, engineers will be so clever that they will find means where all this will be stored with very little energy. And we will have algorithms that do not need as many data anymore in 2050. Until then, we will strain our environment. That's the best story I have to offer. Yeah, thanks here, and this is my team working with me.
Okay, thank you very much. So any questions to the audience? From the audience, sorry.
Delete all your pictures immediately from the phone, okay.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. Resource extraction and all the conflicts and socio-environmental conflicts that are around it is one of the lines of my research. So I'm quite interested in how can in practice, or how do you and your team in practice implement the co-construction process? Because as it's been said, if the questions are not already done together, then the solutions can be, to say the least, weak. Mm-hmm. So how did you do in how do you do in your project?
It's a very good question. Thank you for posing it. This is exactly the problem we are meeting. So we are trying right now more an approach to kind of try to figure out together with different groups of actors how they see problems and solutions, and to do some confrontation also between the different actors, so that I bring knowledge that I bring out of an interview or out of a study of documents, and I bring it back to other actors who are in the field. Co-creation in that sense is something that is only in a very local form possible, that you can restrict, for example, data collection practices and other things. But what I find so a bit despairing, I must confess, I come from a very big university, and there is definitely not a cent of critical reflection but we have an environmental sustainability plan. And I would very much like to see the digital in that environmental sustainability plan. We collect everything, we stream everything. It is this fantasy of being able to keep everything everywhere alive. We collect data from things which nobody will ever look at it anymore. But we have developed this fantasy, and I think we need to start at these levels maybe to kind of break this idea that this is for free. And I think that the digital has very successfully implemented the idea that it is immaterial. That data are not, they don't harm anything, they don't do anything. And actually data do a lot, and I think if we manage to create visibility for these topics and to realize what it means for across the globe, what kind of new injustices are created. And this is something which I think is important because we move towards a world which is much more infrastructure than ever before on many levels. I mean, we have seen that across the board in medicine, in environmental issues. And the question is actually, is that the way to go? Because like that you cannot, it's the question of the global and the local needs to be reposed in new ways, I think. And that is my only answer I can give you right now. Trying to find loopholes in that way where you could ask certain questions and bring that together and make it visible. That's the only thing we are trying right now.
No, then can you head for, just before the break, I will thank you very much. We can applaud the last speaker. And we will certainly continue the debate on your questions about scaling up transdisciplinary research for this very big questions that we heard. There's a little break, so don't panic. I have a little, I will ask Pierre the little slide for the next round of work. So we will, after the little break, we will go, we have 2 tables here, 2 tables in the other room, and we will have 4 groups. And the idea is to work on assessing transdisciplinary research. We'll just show the little questions that we have. And then the groups. So that was the keynote presentations. That's where we have this 1-hour parallel working groups, and then we're going back here for the panel. This is the tables that we made. We try to have more or less, this is the family name, so you will recognize your family name, then you will be on a table like spring, summer, autumn, of winter. So I hope you will be in spring, but not everybody is. Yes. The idea is to have more or less equal groups. So if we see that in some time it's too small, then we can still move around people. And of course, it's just a proposition. If you really want to shift the table, there's really no worry with that. And then on each table there will be a list of questions on how to evaluate 3D processes. And what we ask you is to zoom in on the question that you are most interested in, and then illustrate it around the table so we can get stories of success stories of 3D research. And then we'll reconvene here together. And there are 4 people who I didn't check if they are all on 4 different tables. So we will adjust. So Pierre, Amaury, Isabelle, and Jean-Philippe will be each at a different table. So we will have to adjust so that they will facilitate the debate. So let's take 10 minutes break, and then we found everybody will back on the tables, and I will leave this here that you can see where to head.